Welcome to part 2 of How and When Did the Dinosaurs Die? In part 1, we looked at the overwhelming evidence that the dinosaurs were buried in large segments of Earth strata. They drowned, and many of them were transported downstream and were buried in a fossil graveyard in a type of a log jam. We're going to be now looking at some of the different explanations between the two models, the secular version and the creation model. And many of these are the same, and there are some differences. The secular version, the dinosaurs were involved in a global mass extinction event that wiped out 75% of all living animals and plants. The creation model was there was a global mass extinction event that wiped out 100% of all air-breathing animals, including the dinosaurs. The survivors were on an ark. Number 2, the secular version is that dinosaurs lived 251 to 66 million years ago on a supercontinent. Started off as Pangaea and then broke up. The creation model is the dinosaurs lived on a supercontinent that broke up during and after the flood. Now, the secular model has the dinosaurs living on Pangaea, and then at the time of the extinction event, it had broken up and had moved to the current configuration on the right. I would guess that just even that breaking up period prior to their extinction would have caused some major events. According to National Geographic, the causes of these extinction events are still unsolved mysteries. The creation model, it was one global extinction event. There used to be a supercontinent. It was catastrophically flooded, and the remains were buried on a lot of the land continents that exist today. The secular version is called plate tectonics, and the current continents were formed slowly over millions of years. The creation model also involves plate tectonics, and the continents were formed catastrophically over a much shorter period of time. Now, the upper crust of the Earth, as you see there, is broken into various plates, and those motions is what cause a lot of our earthquakes. The average thickness of that crust is about 18 miles inland and about 2 to 3 miles in the sea. Now, their Pangaea model looks like this. This is what it looked like. And it's called Bullard's fit because it was invented, if you will, in 1965. Some of the issues with this is in order to make it work, Africa is 35% smaller. In fact, as you can see in today's world map, Africa is the second largest continent behind Asia. There is no Central America or southern Mexico. There's a slice made through Europe and Africa, and they're rotated in the opposite direction, as well as North and South America are rotated far different than what they are. Now, both sides agree that there are plate tectonics where the Earth is broken. This is the source of most of our volcanic activity. Notice most of them are underwater. Now, the creation model, we don't know what started the initial flood. There's a reference to the windows of the heavens were open in Genesis. We don't know if that was triggered by an asteroid or whatever event. But the majority of the flooding comes from the fountains of the great deep that burst forth, that subterranean water that exists underneath the Earth's crust. The pre-flood mountains were not like they were today. They were much smaller. And the subterranean water ruptured all around the Earth. It produced some rain, but most of the flooding came from underneath the Earth. Now, we ask ourselves, is there enough water underneath the Earth to even flood the entire world? Well, according to various science studies, we have enough water already that's bigger than all of our oceans. And this was from New Scientists, that there's 10 to 30 times our present oceans are still underneath the Earth's surface. So that is a very scientific possibility. The fountains of the deep ruptured and created like a baseball seam all the way around the Earth. In addition to the plates, these are the mid-Atlantic ridge that separated catastrophically, and the continents moved further apart faster at first and then a little slower towards the end. You can see that much of these ridges, which are volcanic rock, are very similar to the outline of South America and even the African continent. Now, most volcanoes are underwater, about 75%. And one of the reasons for that is the Earth's crust is the thinnest there, so it allows more of the volcanic activity, to come to the surface, which is why Yellowstone has the geysers, because that land area, instead of being 18 miles, it's about 2 to 3 miles there in Wyoming. The Pacific Ocean, here's one of an underwater volcanic activity that erupted. And the factors needed for an ice age are warm oceans. By having much warmer oceans, it increased evaporation for greater snowfall to build the ice sheets on the continents. And in geology, in November 2013, the Greenland ice sheets shrank to its smallest size around 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, when the ocean temperatures were quite high. So we do have some acknowledgement that at the time of the flood, the ocean temperatures were very high. The second thing you need for an ice age is aerosols in the atmosphere. These are tiny airborne particles that would reflect sunlight and keep the ice from melting, especially during the warmer summer months. When Mount St. Helens volcano blew in Washington back in 1980, the volcanic ash from the satellite photo showed that it extended over into 6 states from just one medium-sized volcano. Here's in Washington at noon, so less sunlight, less cooling. Now, the ice age only covered the upper and the lower latitudes, so the cradle of civilization would not have been impacted initially, and it would have as people migrated. Now, the boundary of a continent is not where the water edge of the ocean is. That's its international border. But the boundary of a continent is its continental shelf. And that's that area that is underwater before it dives deep into the continental slope and it goes down into the ocean. California extends out into the ocean 62 miles today, and Siberia extends over 800 miles. And here's the continental shelf, and it's underwater, and this is the current in that kind of a light blue. That's the current shelf. During the Ice Age, because the evaporation in the ocean levels would have been much, much lower, allowing migration of animals and people to the various continents. Now, in addition to the plate tectonics, the secular version has the current mountains began rising after the dinosaurs died over millions of years, 10, 20, 30, and even 60 million years later. The creation model is the current mountains began rising over thousands of years after the dinosaurs lived. It was quick at first after the flood, and then slower since. Now, I think both sides agree that the mountains were pushed up from colliding plate tectonics. Where we disagree is the amount of time that it took. And in Pakistan in 2013, they had a 7.7 earthquake, which created this new island in a relatively short period of time. Here is a news coverage of a 10-week time lapse of Mount St. Helens mountaintop being pushed up.
Tomorrow is the second anniversary of the latest upsurge in volcanic activity at Mount St. Helens. And to mark the occasion, these time-lapse pictures were released showing the growth of the lava dome in the crater during a recent 10-week period. Scientists say they don't know when the current activity will end. They don't see any eruptions in the near future.
Ooh. Wow, that's
pretty spectacular to see, though, that time-lapse.
Many strata were apparently, from the evidence, laid down rapidly. You can see that man there, just to give you a scale with that arrow. Rocks don't bend, and they would break if they are hard. So this is evidence of rock layers that were folded while still wet and pliable before final hardening. And we see that same phenomena in folded mountains. It's as though they were wet, they were pushed up, and gravity pulled many of them down into a folded mountain. They're all over the earth. Up in the Alps, they're probably the most famous examples of the folded mountains. Now in 2000, two scientists, secular scientists that study the origin of mountains, wrote this book. And they claimed that intense geological process were operating when the mountains were formed at rates and scales and intensities far in excess of today's uniform norms. Now this breaks from the general consensus in the secular world. The general consensus is North American Rockies and whatnot are 55 to 80 million years. Based on their data, they're less than 5 million. And the main Colorado Plateau, where Grand Canyon is less than 3 million years old. But we're told that that was carved out, Grand Canyon, in 6 million years. Europe is 30 to 40 million years old. According to their data, its Swiss Alps are less than 2 million. And in Asia, the Himalayas, with Mount Everest, is 3.4 million years, less than that. They concluded that many folds were caused when huge masses of rock slid down slope under the influence of gravity, an idea denied by most geologists today. I will admit, they came under attack, and they responded by saying anyone who disagrees with the ruling theory is regarded as ignorant fool by the majority. But they also said most data from geomorphology, and that's the origin of mountains and land masses, as well as some from geology and geophysics, is omitted or suppressed in favor of a grandiose tectonic picture, a disregard, they said, for what is the field evidence out in the field. Now, in the different explanations, the final, there's two more. There's the geologic column. The secular version is they represent different layers of earth, strata, that were laid down over millions of years. The creation model is it was different layers of earth strata that were laid down during one extinction event, the Noah's flood. So the geologic secular explanation is each one of those layers represents time, and there are some of the mass extinction events that took place, or in the middle, 90% were wiped out, so they had to start all over again. And the creation model is a sorting of layers based upon the mobility of animals, and it represents one event. And then in the secular version, mankind never saw a dinosaur. They were wiped out 65 million years ago, and humans appeared relatively recently, about 200,000 years ago. The secular, or the creation version, is dinosaurs and man lived at the same time. The large dinosaurs existed in the pre-flood Earth, and obviously they didn't live in the same geographical area, and they were smaller in the post-flood and became extinct. Now, looking at some of the scientific evidence for the claim of the creation model, there's lots of what is called Problematica examples. An example of that is in New Mexico, in a rock layer that's alleged to be 238 million years old, there was a human-type footprint. And Smithsonian Magazine called this a puzzling parade of these Permian beasts, acknowledge what paleontologists, fossil people, like to call Problematica. It's kind of unexplained. In the Montana fossil site in 1997, red blood cells when an unfossilized section of a bone from a T-Rex was found. And in 2005, they saw lifelike tissue that had no business in having a bone that's supposed to be 65 million years old and completely rock-like. Here's the tissue A on the right, and it was still flexible when stretched. And the middle photo is the bone after it's air dried, and then on the far right, its fibrous character. This is not seen in a bone millions and millions years old. It was a Problematica. In October 2012, DNA from dinosaur fossils had been reported on 2 separate occasions, and this is recorded in Wikipedia and many online encyclopedias. This was found by Dr. Mary Schweitzer, and they've been challenged, and her claims, according to Wikipedia, have been upheld. So it's still a Problematica. In a carbon-14 was found, a lot of it in a hadrosaur bone. Carbon-14 should have decayed away in no more than 30 to 40,000 years. So this is another Problematica. Piece of skin was reported in physics. As we excavated, according to the Canadian paleontologist, the fossil, I thought we were looking at a skin impression. Then I noticed a piece came off, and I realized this is not ordinary. This is real skin. And then up in Alaska, I mean, it's pretty much all over. They talk about the hadrosaur remains, and it's typically was uncrushed, the bones, and unpermineralized, which is bones that have not turned to stone but are intact dinosaur bones. So in addition to the scientific evidence, in which that was a few, there's some archaeological evidence. Examples are, first of all, the word dinosaur was first used in 1842. You go to World Book Encyclopedia, the dragons of legend are strangely like actual creatures that have lived in the past. They are much like great reptiles, dinosaurs, which inhabited the earth long before man is supposed to have appeared on earth. Every country has them in their mythology. And you see various drawings from the past of man killing or fighting dinosaurs, dragon slayers of different sizes and shapes. And I'm sure some of them have been embellished. Now, this was a brass carving on a tomb found that was created in 1491. And there were common animals, dog with a collar on the left and a bird. But they also found these strange-looking, what appear to be dinosaurs of today. Though that's the one on the right. He's looking back over his shoulder, and there's the one on the left, and his head is buried, and that's its tail, and its tail is very close to the cleft and spikes of a Spinosaurus. So, we don't know. I don't think they were living in 1491. Don't know. It might have been on drawings or other recollections, but it's very remarkable. Now, we also, this is 120 BC. It's a mosaic in Rome, Italy. And there it is there. And if we go in a little closer on that section of the mosaic, you see people with spears fighting reptile-looking animals. This is in the Louvre Museum in France. It's a cylinder seal, dated allegedly 3000 BC, and you can see the animals look very much like many of our dinosaur fossil remains. Here is a hunt in Pompeii in Italy, 79 AD. And again, you see people standing or fighting reptiles, great lizards like, or giant crocodiles, whatever you want to call them. And finally, let's take a look and see if there's any evidence for a global flood. I think you'll find that there was a large variety of divergent evidence that we can consider. The first is there is a consensus there was a mass extinction of global event that was severe and wiped out 75 to 90% of the world's plant and animal species. Second, there are billions of fossils buried in sedimentary earth laid down by water all over the earth and on every continent. In fact, as we look at the continents, the world is a graveyard of animals and plants. There's over 1 million fossil deposits known to exist worldwide. And in South Africa, there's over an estimated 80 billion fossils just buried in that area. In addition to that, there is oil and gas deposits laid down in the form of fossil fuels all over the world. And these are deposits of organic material, plants and animals. The third is there is evidence that the continents and our highest mountain ranges were once underwater. Marine fossils are found in the highest mountains of the world, from the Himalayas to the Alps to the Andes to the Rocky Mountains, all the way up into Alaska. Montana State University, the summit of Mount Everest was actually a seafloor. It is composed of marine limestone, and there's a shell fossil that's found up there. Mount Everest, the geology of Mount Everest website, the bottoms of tropical seas are now over 25,000 feet above sea level, which is the approximate height of Mount Everest. You can see in those red arrows, those are layers of sedimentary earth, limestone. The Tibetan Plateau is huge. It's about half the size of the United States. Its average elevation is 14,800 feet. To give you an idea of that, that is 300, Mount Whitney is 300 feet below the average elevation, and that's our tallest peak within the continental U.S. According to Science Daily, the altitude fossils have been revised, and the scientists were surprised to find thick layers of ancient lake sediment filled with plants and fish and animals, typical of far lower elevations. So 14,000 feet, that area was once an ancient lake sediment. Now, when I was visiting Ouray, Colorado, its elevation is almost 8,000 feet. There was the Nature Center, and it had a sign that said, "Flooded out." And it said if you were standing here millions of years ago, warm water would be swirling about you. So that was at 8,000 feet at present time. Then you go down to Carlsbad Caverns, and you learn that it was formed by an inland sea. And Carlsbad is at about 4,000 feet elevation. And then when I was in San Marcos, their aquifer at 617 feet said, if you were standing here, you would be at the bottom of an ancient sea. Now, it's not a surprise. Most people don't know about it, but one of the models of North America about 90 million years ago was the North American Sea. And you find periodic, like for example, a giant shark fossil was found in Kansas. That little red X to the left is the location, the Grand Canyon, which I'll cover later. So we see that warm inland seas covered much of the U.S., and then the crust of the mountains began to rise slowly. These are the locations where we find dinosaur fossils, and dinosaurs don't inhabit shallow seas. They're looking for vegetation and other animals. here in the red circles, ovals, are the location of our highest mountains today, the Rocky Mountains, and then also there in California. Now, if you check various sources, Nevada, for example, which is shown here being somewhat mountainous, eastern and southern Nevada was covered by a shallow sea. Its sea levels continued to drop. However, the western part of the state was relatively deep. Go up to New York and Pennsylvania, U.S. Geological Survey information, remains of coral and clam shells found in the old limestones in Pennsylvania and New York indicate this region was once covered by a shallow sea. Nebraska, during the early period, Cenozoic, I believe it's pronounced, after 66 million years extinction event, the seas withdrew and the state was home to mammals like camels and rhinoceros. And if you go to Asheville fossil beds, you'll find that life and death in Nebraska waterhole, and this allegedly was 10 million years ago, which is like yesterday, there was a volcanic ash bed, and it preserved fossil rhinos right there in Nebraska. Now, the ash bed was preserved by a thick layer of sandstone rock on top of it. Interesting, buried together was a small three-toed horse and also a one-toed horse. The three-toed horse is supposed to have been an ancestor of the one-toed and died out millions of years, but they were living together. Then there's the Grand Canyon, and if you go to this science book, most of its marine sediment is marine sediment, which tells geologists that the Grand Canyon was once underwater. Some of the layers even contain fossils of sea creatures, sharks, and squid. Now, over in Europe, in live science, during the Jurassic period, Europe was submerged in a shallow sea, and most all of the animals lived on small islands. The other item number 4 is layers of similar sediments spread over a large area throughout the world. Here we see Gooseneck Park, Bryce Canyon, Zion, and the Grand Canyon. Here's Gooseneck Park up in Utah, and there's a sign there that says there was a shallow sea deposit, and that in Utah it's the same limestone as the top layer of the Grand Canyon 270 miles away. The red wall limestone of Grand Canyon is billions of marine fossils in a thick layer that stretches 180 miles from Arizona to southern Nevada. This is what's called the Grand Staircase, and the creation model was created by receding flood theory, but it's the similarity of various layers of strata that run from the Grand Canyon on the left all the way up to Bryce Canyon. In fact, there's the Navajo sandstone area that continues over the Grand Canyon, the Red Wall, and the Tapiat sandstone. And as an example, the Tapiat sandstone is 230 feet thick. There's large boulders at the bottom of it, and it extends through North America into northern Canada. Geologists agree that sand grains washed up on the continent as part of the first great marine transgression, and boulders 30 feet in diameter at the bottom, which may have rolled when the continents were underwater. If we go over to the Grand Canyon, all the layers contain marine fossils. We go over to England, the chalk beds of England. It's a distinctive white limestone layer that extends from England through the English Channel over 2,000 miles away. Goes into Ireland, Germany, Poland, Turkey, and even down into the Middle East. And similar types of chalk beds are also found in the United States as well as the western section of Australia. Number 5 is, well, okay, if there was a global flood, what happened to all the water that was covering the Earth? The Earth's surface is 71% water, and the ocean is 10 times greater than all the volume of land above sea level. In Psalms 104, referring to Noah's flood, the water stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. The mountains rose, and the valleys sank to the place that you appoint them. And as you can see in that ocean trench, some of these trenches are deeper than what Mount Everest is high at sea level. In Wandering Continents, a publication about the seafloors, Dr. King said every part of the globe on the continents or in the ocean basins provide direct geological evidence that formerly it stood at different levels up or down. And you can see that one trench over to the right at 35,000 feet deep. So as the weight of the ocean sunk the floor, the continents were formed and pushed up. We also find aquifers all over the world. And if the aquifer dries up, then it collapses and it doesn't exist much. Here's a map of the US aquifers, which is the source of most of our farming and city water. Over in Africa, BBC News had an article, Huge Water Resource Under Africa. Due to changes in climate that have turned the Sahara into a desert over centuries ago, many of the aquifers underneath were last filled with water over 5,000 years ago. That's a little close to Noah's flood. Number 6, we have global flood accounts in all cultures. There's over 200. Many of these cultures, most of them, were independent of any Christian missionary. They had existed since the dawn of man. Josephus, a Jewish historian, wrote in 93 A.D., now all the writers of barbarian histories make mention of this flood and of this ark. Among them is Berosus, the Chaldean, who is a Babylonian writer. Josephus had no idea there were people over in South America and in the Incas and elsewhere that had also recorded this. Now, the church often does a disservice by showing Noah's ark as something like this. That's a wrong image to have in their minds. The ark was 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. The ratio of its length to its width is 6:1. And this is the same ratio that modern shipbuilders use for stability in the sea. This largest cruise ship still has that ratio of length to width of 6:1. What about the Grand Canyon? Now, I raise that issue because many people believe that the reliability of the Bible has been disproved. And this Professor Kaku has many numerous BBC films and YouTube links, and he's a professor of theoretical physics, and he kind of has a little Einstein hairdo going on, so he sounds very credible. He said in 1654, James Ussher, a church leader, determined that based on the Bible, that creation occurred 4000 BC. Well, you know, a lot of Christians don't necessarily believe the earth is young, so that's not a deal breaker for the reliability of the Bible. It is a secondary issue. But what he basically was saying, since Ussher was wrong about 4000 BC, therefore the whole Bible cannot be trusted, and he based it on this one single statement, the Grand Canyon. And he said, unimaginable eons of time are needed to carve out the canyons. Therefore, the earth cannot be thousands, 6 or more thousand years old. Interesting that in our paper carried this article, which was an AP story. Mars may once have had rivers. And in the article it said, many channels on Mars dwarf our own Grand Canyon in size, and in order to form would have required torrential floods so spectacular as to be hard to visualize by Earth standards. So, based on this article and the scientists' interpretation of Mars, it's okay to interpret channels like Grand Canyon in terms of flooding. It's possible to accept flooding explanation for a planet that has no water. And they acknowledge flooding on a scale far greater than anything recorded on Earth. And the same thing would have happened during Noah's flood. Now, J. Harlan Brents was an American geologist, and he was ridiculed for 40-some years, from 1927 to 65, for suggesting floodwaters from an ancient glacier rapidly created canyons in Washington state. He was determined to be right in 1965, and they put this plaque in his honor, who patiently taught us that catastrophic floods may sometimes play a role in nature's unfolding drama. The Columbian Plateau up in Washington state there had this Missoula floods, and it's alleged this was due to melting ice sheets that filled basins, and then those basins breached, and that was thousands of years ago. This is what's left of it. It's called Dry Falls, Washington, and it's the greatest known waterfall ever existed. It was 5 times larger than Niagara Falls, and it's estimated the water moved at over 60 miles per hour. Here is the canyon in southeastern Washington, and the geologists believe floodwaters from Lake Missoula formed this canyon in days over 1,000 years ago. This is also up in Washington. This is Burlingham Canyon, and it's what it looked like in 1926. And then a series of water canals broke on a very small scale, and a canyon 1,500 feet long, 120 feet deep and wide, was instantly formed. Now, when Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, it melted some glacier at the very top of it, snowpack, and this canyon was formed in one day. You see the little river at the bottom? Actually, the canyon formed the river, not the other way around. These 3 different layers of sediment and strata were formed in 3 days. Mount St. Helens in 6 years, from 1980 to 1986, has added 600 feet of new strata. That's about half the height of the Empire State Building. At this rate, 5,700 feet of strata of the Grand Canyon could have been laid down in 57 years at that rate. So the Grand Canyon, we're told that this little river created it. Never in the history of mankind have we ever seen a little river over millions of years create a gigantic canyon. But we have seen water and flooding do that on a smaller scale. They also argue one of the obstacles that the Grand Canyon has to explain is the river enters at 2,800 feet, and the highest plateau averages on the north rim to the south rim 5,000 to 8,500 feet. So how does water go uphill? And the explanation is the plateau was rising up to keep track with the oncoming slow erosion. This concludes our presentation. I hope it gave you information to ponder and even check out. And please check out some of our other websites. Thank you.